If you buy one of these off the internet this week and power it up cold, there's a real chance you smoke a pair of speakers, or the amp itself. I've had 3 of these 5 monsters on my bench, and I've seen what 50-year-old capacitors do when they finally quit. Stick around. I'll tell you what these things actually are, what they cost to keep alive, and which ones are worth the hunt. I'm Gary Simmons. I've been opening up amplifiers since Nixon was in office, and I run a little bench in my garage restoring vintage gear for a living. If that's your kind of thing, hit subscribe. No pressure, just glad to have you. Back in the mid-1970s, every major manufacturer decided the way to win your money was watts, not reliability, and the engineers got one assignment: build something that makes the next brand's factory nervous. That's how we ended up with transformers you could use as boat anchors, and amplifiers that pulled a kilowatt out of the wall just idling. Folks call this stretch the Watt Wars. Let's get into them. Number 5. The Sansui BA-5000. I've had one of these on my bench exactly once, and I remember thinking this thing is not an amplifier, it's a piece of furniture. The BA-5000 came out of Sansui in 1975 as the flagship of their Definition series, and it weighs 108 pounds. Not an internet exaggeration. I've picked one up, or tried to. Most of that weight isn't decoration. It's a genuine output transformer sitting right in the signal path, along with a hefty dual power supply with separate windings for each side, so the two sides don't fight each other on transients. Here's what makes it strange even for 1975 standards. Almost nobody else building solid-state gear at this power level was still using an output transformer. Direct-coupled, transformerless output stages had become the industry standard because they measured better and cost less to build. Sansui went the other way on purpose. The company started out in Tokyo in 1947 as a transformer manufacturer full stop before they ever built a receiver. So when the rest of the industry moved on, Sansui leaned into the one thing they'd been doing since the post-war years, and it shows. That transformer does 2 jobs. It keeps the amp stable into almost any speaker load, a genuine 300 watts per channel, whether you hang 8 ohms, 4 ohms, or 2 ohms off of it, which on lesser amps of this era is a good way to trip a protection circuit. And it acts as a natural low-frequency filter, trimming subsonic garbage before it reaches your woofers. Sansui built a 300-watt monster and then engineered it not to murder the speakers it was driving. That's not something I see much of from this era. On the bench, here's what I watch for. These run 8 discrete output transistors per channel in a 4-parallel configuration. And after 50 years, the thing that fails first is almost never the transformer. It's the electrolytic caps in the power supply drying out, the bias drifting, and the switch contacts and pots getting scratchy from decades of oxidation. If you find one, ask specifically whether the main filter caps have been replaced, because when they let go on an amp pulling this much current, it's not a gentle failure. Original price was around $1,300 in 1975, a month's rent for a lot of people. Clean examples today with meters intact and the transformer verified good run well into 4 figures, and honestly, it's the most underrated amp on this list. Most casual collectors have never even heard of it. Number 4. The Marantz Model 500. If the Sansui is the overbuilt tank, the Marantz Model 500 is the temperamental race car, gorgeous, fast, and one bad day from a full teardown. Marantz released it around 1972, rated at 250 watts per channel into 8 ohms. And unlike a lot of the competition, they didn't just buy off-the-shelf output transistors and bolt them in. They co-developed custom power transistors and built the output stage as a genuine complementary push-pull design, end-to-end, a serious engineering commitment for the time, not a marketing line. What that bought you sonically is something owners still talk about, a big, controlled, detailed sound with bass authority that made the polite Japanese receivers of the day sound a little shy by comparison. The design applied negative feedback at 2 separate stages, once off the preamp and again around the output, specifically to keep distortion low at both a whisper and at full tilt. This wasn't an amp built to hit a spec sheet number, it was built to be excellent. So, why is it only at number 4? Because owning one is a commitment. It's a complicated amplifier with lots of discrete parts and a power supply built around a hefty 2.2 kilowatt transformer and computer-grade capacitors storing real energy, over 280 joules sitting there waiting for you to be careless with a meter probe. Tracing a fault through that dual complementary topology takes patience, and parts for the custom Marantz Motorola output devices aren't sitting on a shelf anymore. Collectors have told me these were genuinely difficult to keep running even when new, and 50-plus years on, that hasn't gotten easier. If you track down a clean, properly working Model 500, you've found something special. Arguably one of the best-sounding amplifiers of the early 70s. Just budget for a tech comfortable with discrete complementary designs, and don't expect a quick fix if something lets go. Quick note, if this is making you want to go hunting for one of these yourself, I put together a short guide on what to check before you buy and what red flags to walk away from. Links in the description if that's useful. Number 3. The Pioneer SX-1980. I have to be straight with you, the SX-1980 is technically a receiver, not a standalone power amp. It's got a full AM/FM tuner built in along with the amplifier, but the amp section earns its spot, and this is the machine that dragged the Watt Wars out of the enthusiast magazines and into mainstream culture. Pioneer released it in 1978, rated at 270 watts per channel into 8 ohms, making it the most powerful receiver Pioneer had ever built. Then Leonard Feldman ran it on the bench for Audio magazine and found the rating was conservative. Under the short burst conditions real music creates, it was producing something close to 460 watts per channel. Pioneer had actually undersold their own flagship, which almost never happens in this business. It weighs 78 pounds, with a toroidal transformer and heat sinks big enough to feed a rack of pizza with the heat this thing throws under load. Distortion is rated at 0.03%, a whisper-quiet number plenty of modern gear still struggles to beat. The tuner wasn't an afterthought either. It used a quartz-locked frequency system that held a station without drifting as the chassis warmed, genuinely advanced for a consumer product in '78. Run it up near full output and it'll pull close to 1,000 watts from the wall. That's not a gentle appliance. That's closer to a space heater with a volume knob. Pioneer marketed it as a super receiver, and in 1978 ran a full-page ad for it in Playboy, because owning the biggest receiver on the block had become a status symbol next to your car in the driveway. On the bench, what I check first on any SX-1980 is DC offset at the speaker terminals and bias current, since those drift after decades and can cook an output transistor if ignored, plus the big filter caps and the smaller electrolytics scattered through the preamp board. The good news, parts and documentation are relatively well supported in the vintage community, since there are a lot of these out there. Was it actually the most powerful receiver of the era? No, and this is the part most videos skip. The Technics SA-1000 beat it on paper at 330 watts a year earlier, and the Marantz 2600 matched it closer at 300. On raw spec, Pioneer wasn't even winning, but the SX-1980 had the look and the story, and that's the one collectors fell for. Clean, serviced examples today run anywhere from several $1,000s into 5 figures for museum-grade units. The legend usually beats the spec sheet when it comes to what empties your wallet. Number 2. The Macintosh MC-2300. If the others on this list are monsters, the Macintosh MC-2300 is built like a bank vault. Macintosh produced it from 1971 through 1980, and it's exactly what you picture when someone says serious American amplifier. Black glass front panel, those unmistakable glowing blue meters, and a weight that most sources put well over 100 pounds, with some units clocking closer to 140 depending on the exact vintage and configuration. It's rated at 300 watts per channel into 8 ohms, or 600 watts bridged to mono, and Macintosh being Macintosh, that rating is famously conservative. Independent bench tests routinely find these putting out more clean power than the badge promises. What sets the MC-2300 apart electrically is the same trick that put it in a different category from almost every other solid-state amp of the era: output autoformers. Instead of coupling directly to the speaker terminals, Macintosh ran the output through their own transformer design, which meant this amp could deliver its full rated power into practically any speaker load you threw at it, from 1 ohm all the way up to 16, without the sag or instability that trips up a lot of transformerless designs into a tough load. Add in a genuine protection system Macintosh called Sentry Monitoring, which watches the output devices and shuts things down before they cook themselves, and you've got an amplifier that was engineered for reliability first and bragging rights second, which is honestly a rare philosophy in this whole story. And then there's the story that made it a legend. In 1974, the Grateful Dead built their famous Wall of Sound touring system, and they used somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 Macintosh MC-2300 amplifiers to power it, pushing something like 26,000 to nearly 29,000 watts of clean power, capable of throwing intelligible low-distortion sound roughly 600 feet across an open field. That system only toured for about 7 months before the logistics of hauling it around became impossible. But for that stretch, this amplifier was holding up the most ambitious sound reinforcement rig in rock history. Jerry Garcia's personal MC-2300, nicknamed Budman for the Budweiser sticker slapped on the front, sold at a Sotheby's auction in 2021 for $378,000. One amplifier, the price of a house. A regular, honestly restored MC-2300 today won't touch that number, but even ordinary examples pull solid 4-figure money, and they earn it. On the bench, these are genuinely some of the toughest amps I service, which is exactly why so many of them still power on and hit spec 50 years later. The usual suspects are still the multi-section filter caps, aging output relays, and the input wiring on early units, which some techs have gone degraded over time and needed replacing outright. If you find a well-documented, professionally serviced MC-2300, you're holding one of the most overbuilt pieces of consumer electronics ever sold. Number 1. The Phase Linear 700. This is the one that started the whole fight, and it's also the most reckless machine on this list. Back in 1970, a young engineer, Bob Carver, working with his partner Steve Johnston, looked at the high-end audio market and made a bet nobody else would take. He built a home amplifier rated at 350 watts per channel and priced it at $749, a little more than $1 a watt, at a time when getting that kind of power from an established brand cost you double or more. Carver blew the pricing model apart overnight, and the touring world noticed immediately. At the Macintosh listening clinics in 1970 and 1971, where gear got measured head-to-head, the little upstart Phase Linear reportedly outmuscled the room, Macintosh included. Pink Floyd, Aerosmith, Black Sabbath, and the Grateful Dead all ended up running banks of these on tour because nothing else delivered that much clean power for that little money. But there was a catch, and that's the reason this amp is both a legend and a cautionary tale in the same breath. To hit that price point, Carver made some real trade-offs. The original 700 shipped without proper DC protection circuitry, and the heat sinking wasn't sized for how hard touring crews and home users alike actually pushed these things. When a channel failed on an early 700, it could dump close to 100 volts of raw DC straight into your speaker oil coils. And 100 volts of DC into a speaker does exactly what you'd expect. It cooks the coil, sometimes visibly. Owners started calling it the Flame Linear, and the nickname stuck because it earned it. This was, by some measures, the best-selling high-power amplifier in America at the time, and part of its reputation was that it might genuinely torch your speakers. To his credit, Carver didn't leave it there. The 700B and the later Series 2 added better cooling, a proper complementary output design, and real protection circuitry, taming the fire risk while keeping the punch that made touring engineers love it in the first place. He also released a smaller sibling, the Phase Linear 400, which actually became the bigger seller of the two and shares the family reputation, good and bad. On my bench, an original 700 that hasn't been modified is one I treat carefully. No bleeder resistors across the main filter caps on some of these means those rails can hold a genuinely dangerous charge even unplugged, so I'm careful with two-handed measurements around it. And that's not me being dramatic, that's just how these were built. If you find one, don't power it up cold off a stranger's word that it worked when it was put in storage. Have the protection circuitry checked, verify the bias, and if it hasn't been serviced, assume the caps need attention before you trust it near a good pair of speakers. Carver eventually sold his stake in Phase Linear to Pioneer in 1979 and went on to found Carver Corporation, chasing more clever, occasionally mad designs for decades after.
But the 700 is where it started. Cheaper than the Macintosh, more powerful than almost anything on the market, adored by touring crews, and feared a little by speaker owners. If the Watt Wars had a single spark, this amplifier lit it.
A few that almost made the cut. A handful of others deserve a mention before we wrap up. The Technics SA-1000 receiver actually outspec'd Pioneer's SX-1980 on paper at 330 watts per channel and around 90 pounds. The Marantz 2600 matched 300 watts and is genuinely rare on the used market today. And the Sansui BA-5000 was another 300-watt super receiver that could double as a home security deterrent, given nobody's carrying that thing out the door quietly. Any one of those could have swapped in on a different day. Here's the part I actually care about most, because I don't want you getting burned, financially or literally. These are all 40-plus years old now, and that changes the math on everything. First, assume the capacitors need attention. Every amp on this list runs on electrolytic caps that have been drying out since disco was new. And a tired cap in a high-voltage supply isn't cosmetic, it's a safety issue. Get anything unserviced checked before you power it up. Second, be skeptical of the word serviced. I hear it used for everything from a full bench restoration with documented measurements down to somebody blowing out dust and swapping a fuse. Ask what was actually replaced. Ask for photos of the inside, not just the faceplate. Ask if it was tested at full rated output. Fourth, respect what these things can do to modern speakers. They make enough clean power to destroy gear that wasn't built for it, so know your speaker's limits before you get comfortable with the volume knob. Third, factor in shipping if you're not buying local. A 100-pound amplifier is a genuine freight challenge, and I've seen plenty of survivors arrive with a cracked meter or a bent faceplate because a box got dropped somewhere along the way. Buy local when you can, and hear it running before money changes hands. And finally, originality still matters for value. Original meters, faceplate, and casework are the difference between a fair price and an inflated one on a collector-grade piece. Replaced parts are fine if you just want to enjoy the amp. Just don't pay grail money for something that's quietly had half its faceplate swapped out. What gets me every time I have one of these open on the bench is that this whole era was basically a marketing fight over a single number. And in the middle of all that ego, these companies accidentally built some of the toughest, most over-engineered pieces of consumer electronics this country and Japan ever produced. Machines that have outlived the companies that made some of them. So, here's what I'll leave you with. 50 years from now, will anything we're building today still be sitting on somebody's bench getting recapped by a guy who cares enough to keep it running right? That's worth thinking about next time you're tempted to toss something instead of fixing it. I'll see you at the next bench.